The adventures of the most enigmatic adventurer Stanley Davidson from a small village in the Amazon jungle. He was already in his 60s when he set off on a long journey, and all the villagers were talking about him. In 1998, after much deliberation, Stanley decided to go in search of a lost tribe of Indians in the deep Amazon jungle. He chose the place where this tribal group was last seen and set out on his journey. At first, his road was blocked by the local fauna. Dangerous snakes, poisonous spiders, swamps, and impassable jungle. However, despite all the difficulties, Stanley continued his journey, collecting all possible information about the mysterious tribe. He found a trail that had disappeared, discovered a cave where the Indians might be hiding, and finally reached a place where it was rumored he could find his way back to the tribe. But before he set off on his journey, he talked to a local man who told him about a strange creature living in those parts. Stanley took it as a joke. The man was talking about something big, huge, and hairy creature. Stanley had heard stories about Bigfoot, but he knew they were all fiction. Bigfoot is a terrifying creature from legends which pursues unfortunate travelers in the mountains, leaving behind only destruction and fear. Its huge image and icy gaze fill people's hearts with terror, and its strength and bloodlust make them tremble with terror. Bigfoot is the true terror of the mountains that knows no pity or compassion, only cold and death. 400 kilograms of weight, 3 meters tall, and thick fur. This beast has been wanted all over the world for centuries. The lucky ones tell of encounters with him and post videos on the web. The Yeti is described as a huge, fur-covered creature resembling a human, but with a more animal-like appearance. His long arms and legs are covered in thick fur, which helps him survive in the cold conditions of the mountains. Deep eyes and huge fangs only add to its menace. Bigfoot is considered a dangerous and aggressive creature, capable of attacking people and animals to satisfy its need for food. It is known for its ferocity and bloodlust, which makes it one of the most dangerous animals in the mountainous regions. There are many stories and legends of Bigfoot encounters where these creatures attack unsuspecting travelers and hunters. Often these attacks end tragically with dead or missing people. Despite the fact that many people are convinced that Bigfoot exists, there is no scientific proof of his existence. He remains only a myth that has frightened and terrified people for centuries. Stanley, realizing that such stories could just be myths and legends, still decided to take it into consideration and be vigilant in his search. He stocked up on all the necessary equipment and provisions and bravely set off deep into the jungle. At first, the journey went smoothly. Stanley encountered beautiful scenery, various animals and plants of the Amazon, and everything seemed to be going according to plan. However, as he got closer to where the tribe was supposedly located, he began to notice strange footprints and sounds that could not be explained. At night, he heard something incomprehensible, which seemed to him as if it were the loud breathing of an entity of enormous proportions. One day, as Stanley was walking through the jungle, he noticed a strange trail that looked like the tracks of a large animal, but not like any animal he knew of in the area. He decided to follow these tracks to solve this mystery. Soon he discovered a huge, thick trail, similar to that of an elephant, but with some differences. He realized that this was something completely new and uncharted. Stanley continued to follow the unknown tracks, overcoming all the difficulties and dangers of the journey. He began to notice that it seemed like someone was following him. Something was making noises in the darkness and causing a chill to run down his spine. But he did not give up. His passion for adventure and thirst for knowledge were stronger than fear. One day, while trudging through a dense forest, Stanley came across a cave that seemed abandoned and quite unlike the caves other creatures had inhabited. He decided to explore it and went inside. In the depths of the cave, he discovered some strange footprints and mysterious objects that could have belonged to Indians from a lost tribe. Stanley felt that someone was sneaking into his camp at night and rummaging through his belongings. One morning, he woke up and found that his axe, which he always kept handy, had disappeared. This was strange, for he remembered that he had put it next to his tent last night. Stanley looked through all his equipment, but the axe was still missing. Such occurrences began to happen more and more frequently. One day, his flashlight, which was lying at the entrance to his tent, disappeared, and the next time his thermal underwear disappeared. Stanley could not understand what was happening. Who could have manipulated his belongings in this way? He began to feel that someone or something was watching him, playing cat and mouse with him. Stanley decided to find out who was thus taunting him by skillfully stealing his belongings. At first, Stanley decided to set one of the traps near his tent, hiding some rocks there to hear if anyone was climbing around the entrance. He also placed a knife near the mat in front of the tent so he could hear if anyone caught onto it. He then decided to set a trap for dinner, hooking a string to a small bell to hear if someone tried to steal his catch. He also placed a piece of meat near the tent to attract creatures that he assumed might be its occupants. Another trap was placed on a rope near the camp to cause a ruckus if anyone tried to break into the camp. Finally, he placed a bright flashlight near the lake to attract the attention of nocturnal creatures and see if they were the cause of his losses. The next morning, Stanley woke up to find that all his traps had worked, but there was no one in the camp. He realized that something or someone was really following him and playing cat and mouse with him. Despite his best efforts, however, he was unable to catch the intrusive observer. But what happens next comes as a shock. The next day, Stanley decided to go for a long walk in the neighborhood. He took a backpack with provisions and water, a shotgun in case of danger, and of course his trusty knife. Stanley explored forest trails and mountain peaks. He enjoyed the natural beauty and tranquility of the surroundings. He also managed to shoot some game for supper and cooked himself a delicious roast on the fire. He returned to camp and went to bed. Waking up was quite unusual. He was no longer lying in his sleeping bag, but hanging. He hung in absolute darkness, literally clenched by his sack and the things that filled it. He thought of cutting a hole in his sleeping bag with a knife, but he could not move his arm or leg. The sleeping bag was dragged by someone big and very strong. His sniffing and grunting could be heard from time to time to the helpless man. Had he been kidnapped by that huge, wild, hairy man the local man had spoken of? This was a question Stanley had asked himself more than once, feeling the creature being lifted with its heavy burden somewhere upward. The most frustrating thing was that he was armed but could not use a gun or knife. The creepiest sensation he had was when Stanley felt that the sleeping bag with him was hanging over some void and he was going down as if on an elevator. Finally, the sleeping bag hit the ground. His body was completely stiff. It was hard to even move. He poked his head out of the sack and took a frantic gulp of fresh air. It was still dark, and he could hear some inarticulate mumbling. Stanley awoke to a strange rustling and whispering in the cave. He rubbed his arm to dispel the last remnants of sleep and tried to see around him. His eyes adjusted to the darkness, and he saw that there were several figures in the cave. The first thing that caught his eye were large, yellow eyes, shining in the gloom like two fires burning in the night. They were staring intently at Stanley, making his heart sink with fear. Standing before him were three creatures resembling huge humanoid apes, with long arms covered with thick fur. They seemed menacing and wild, but there was something else glimmering in their eyes: curiosity and interest. Stanley felt fear overwhelm him, but he prudently restrained himself and showed no signs of panic. He realized that he needed to stay calm to survive this incomprehensible situation. One of the creatures approached him, and Stanley saw that it had long fangs and mighty muscles ready to attack. Bigfoot was a huge creature, standing about twice the height of a man. Its body was covered with thick fur that shimmered in the moonlight, which made it look even more intimidating. Its sharp fangs gleamed in the darkness, and its eyes, glowing in the darkness, seemed like some kind of hellfire. Bigfoot's mom was as huge and powerful as Bigfoot's dad. Its fur was a dark color, making it look even more intimidating. It had terrifying fangs and mighty paws, ready to tear up anything in its path. The Yeti child was smaller than his parents, but still seemed formidable and wild. His eyes were full of curiosity and playfulness, but at the same time there was danger in them. He imitated his parents, trying to be just as strong and fierce. All three of them looked like mountain spirits brought to life from ancient legends. They stood before Stanley like guards of a secret temple, ready to punish anyone who dared to disturb their privacy. Stanley realized that he would have to do everything he could to survive the situation and find a way to escape from the clutches of this terrifying Bigfoot family. Stanley was exhausted and frightened after 3 days of captivity. He didn't eat or drink, his head spinning with hunger and fear. Every time he tried to free himself, the Yeti were alert and seemed to be just waiting for an opportune moment to punish him for trying to escape. Finally, on the 4th day, when Stanley had given up hope of rescue, the Yeti decided to untie him. They threw a piece of raw meat in front of him, hissing at him menacingly. Stanley realized that this was a challenge and he had to show his strength and survive in this harsh environment. He accepted the challenge, and despite his hunger and weakness, he grabbed the meat and began to eat it greedily. The Yeti were watching him, and he realized that every move he made was being monitored and evaluated. He had to show all his skills and survive the ordeal. Stanley spent long hours contemplating a plan to escape from the Bigfoot's clutches. He knew that trying to escape could be his last, but he decided to take his chances. He noticed that the Yeti had become more careless and relaxed, allowing him more freedom of movement. He watched their habits closely and learned that they regularly went hunting at certain times of the day. Stanley decided to use this time to try to escape. When the Yeti went hunting, he quickly freed himself from his restraints and grabbed his backpack with his remaining provisions. He considered several escape options and chose the best one through the gorge that led to the rocky cliffs. He knew that the Yeti could not easily chase him in such a territorial place. Stanley ran without turning around, sensing that the Yeti were watching him. He could hear their growls and noisy footsteps in the distance, but he didn't stop. He knew his only chance was to run as far and as fast as possible. He made his way down the slope, jumping over rocks and tree roots, moving under the cover of night. Suddenly, he heard the roar of the Yeti behind him. He realized that they had begun to pursue him. Fear gripped him, but he didn't give up. He quickened his step, trying to run out of the gorge. Soon he reached the cliff, and a view of the bottomless abyss opened up before him. He realized that he would have to jump over it to escape. Stanley took a step back, took a run up, and leaped over the chasm. His heart sank as he felt himself floating in the air. He was able to cling to the edge of the cliff and climb out to safe ground. He turned around and saw a Yeti flying after him. Bigfoot clung to Stanley's leg. Stanley tried desperately to fight off the Yeti, but his strength was much greater. He could feel the sharp fangs penetrating his skin, leaving a trail of pain and blood. He screamed in anguish, but no one could hear him in this wilderness. Ahead of him, Stanley had a long week of captivity and torment at the hands of the Yeti. He was bound and placed in a cave where the creatures left him without food or water, taunting him and subjecting him to mental and physical challenges. Fear, fatigue, and despair overwhelmed him, and he began to doubt his strength and ability to escape this death trap. However, despite the hardships, Stanley did not give up. He thought back to all his adventures surviving the most difficult situations and realized that he needed to keep hope and fortitude. He began to develop an escape plan, analyzing Bigfoot behavior and looking for the creature's weaknesses that could help him free himself. During the long days and nights Stanley spent in captivity, he began to observe Bigfoot rituals and behavior, which helped him understand their motives and ways of communicating. Stanley was shackled. He spent days and nights in total darkness. His only connection to the outside world was the sounds and noises coming to him from outside. He could hear the Yeti whispering and growling as they discussed his fate and their plans. He realized that he needed to find a way to free himself and escape. But how? Stanley decided to use all his cunning and intuition to devise an escape plan. He began to observe the Yeti's behavior and daily actions, trying to understand their weaknesses and habits. He noticed that the creatures often went hunting at the same time each day, leaving the cave unguarded for a short time. This was his chance. Stanley noticed that one of the Yeti always stayed on guard while the others went hunting. This guard was smaller than the other two creatures, and Stanley realized that he could use his smaller size and possible weakness to attack. He began to develop a plan. When the time came, Stanley waited for two of the Yetis to go hunting, leaving the one Yeti in the cave. He noticed the Yeti move away from him to set up near the exit. Stanley quickly and quietly released his hands from the shackles and prepared for action. With the Guardian on his guard, Stanley jumped out from around the corner and delivered a hard blow with a log to the Yeti's head. The creature howled in pain and collapsed, unconscious. Stanley quickly freed himself from his shackles and grabbed his backpack of belongings. He made a skillful maneuver around the remaining Yeti and ran out of the cave. The Yeti, however, quickly came to his senses and began hunting the fugitive. After a while, they howled at full power, filling the air with their terrifying, menacing sounds. Stanley realized that these creatures would not let him leave so easily. He ran through forests and fields, breaking through bushes and rocks. The Yeti were always close by, but he didn't stop trying to keep a safe distance from them. He knew that his only chance was to find shelter and wait out the night before running on. Stanley found an ancient abandoned temple that could be his salvation. He made his way inside and hid in one of the rooms, hoping the Yeti wouldn't find him here. He clenched his fists and prepared for tomorrow, when he would have to continue his journey to freedom. In the morning, when Stanley left the temple, he found that the Yeti had left his unbroken trail. He was free, but his journey was just beginning. He was hungry, tired, and exhausted, but his spirit was indestructible. He set off through the jungle, where he would once again face danger and adventure. But he knew that this was the only way he could prove to himself and everyone that Stanley Davidson was a true adventurer, capable of overcoming any difficulty and finding his way to his goal. Thus ended Stanley Davidson's adventure, which was his most difficult and dangerous challenge. He survived in the clutches of Bigfoot, managed to devise an escape plan and find his way to freedom. His story became a legend among locals and adventurers, and still stirs the minds and hearts of those who believe in the strength of the spirit and determination of man.